inevitable. That's a tricky word to say, but essentially it means unable to be avoided, or sure to occur, happen, or come. For example, if one studies, it is inevitable that one would get a good mark on your grades. Today, we are looking at the second video in the chapter, To What Extent Was the League of Nations a Success? As a reminder, there are 4 focus points, and the focus point that we will be looking at today is how far did weaknesses in the League's organization make failure inevitable? As you can imagine, I'm having a little difficulty saying this word. I don't know why, it's always been the case, I just can't say it. So, for today's purposes, instead of saying was failure, we're going to say likely to happen. So specifically, we're going to look at the League of Nations, which was established after the First World War, and see if the failure of the League of Nations was likely to happen because of the way that it was set up. And today's discussion will be broken into 3 different categories. First, we're going to be looking at the organization itself. We're going to be looking at the membership of the League of Nations. And then finally, we're going to be looking at a concept called collective security. Now, when we look at the many sides of the League, and page 24 of our textbook does a very nice job of sort of explaining all the different parts, we can go through and we can say there's the Assembly, there's the International Labor Group that is looking at best practices of how Europe can operate in the years after the war, specifically looking at child labor laws, for example. We can look at the Court of International Justice. So when countries have disputes between each other, instead of going to war with one another, you can take them to court and decide it that way. There's also the Council, which are the members from each of the different nations, which meet once a year and make decisions. And they form committees to look at different topics, such as commissions and, well, there's a lot of issues. There's slavery, there's refugees after the war, and then there's those pesky problems of the First World War, such as the areas of Danzig, which are taken from Germany. In other words, it's a lot of work to do, isn't it? But instead of looking at these many arms or sides of the League, one of the things that I want you to put into perspective is that this is not a flat organization. Instead, it's an organization that has many sides, and it's all working together in order to build this new world order, this grand idea that Woodrow Wilson has. And they do that by not focusing on one particular issue, but many different sides. Now, when we talk about the League of Nations, of course, the membership of the different nations is a very important one. Of course, Britain and France are 2 of the most important because they're the ones that are the members of the Big 3, the victors of the First World War. And they essentially will take a prominent role in pushing the League of Nations into different issues. Then we have our friend Uncle Sam and the United States. Even though Woodrow Wilson essentially comes up with this idea, he is the principal person at the peace treaties that comes up with the idea that we need to have this organization. In the end, the United States, after the First World War, decides not to join and becomes sort of an isolationist nation. Isolation means that they want to be left alone and not be troubled by the problems of Europe. So, in the end of the Big 3, only 2 are left, and that means that Britain and France have to take the lead in creating this new League of Nations. Now, who are some other members? There are the losers in the war, such as Germany. But one of the things that's very interesting is that Germany is not allowed to join the League of Nations until much later. And that gives the appearance that essentially the League of Nations is not about building a new democratic and peaceful Europe, but instead it is a victor's justice, or in other words, it is the winners of the First World War that get to choose what is happening. There are members such as Italy that join the League of Nations. Remember, Italy is on the winning side of the war. However, when problems arise later in the 1930s, and we'll get to that, and Italy is criticized for invading another nation, they simply decide to leave. If the League of Nations is going to be critical to the actions that we make, then we don't want to be a part of it. The same can be said for Japan. Japan is an original member of the League of Nations, but when they are criticized for their invasion of Manchuria, and we'll get into this a little later, they also decide to withdraw and not be a part of the process. So this is a fundamental problem with the membership. On one side, you only have the victors, and then on the other side, the issue is that when individuals find out that they are being criticized, instead of trying to fix the problems, they simply decide to leave. The last part of this particular unit that I want to talk about is a concept called collective security. And the whole idea behind this is that essentially everybody has to work together in order to keep the peace. And when nations fall out of line, they need to be punished. And collective security is divided into three areas. One, if a nation is aggressive or needs to be punished, essentially they have this idea of shame, essentially turning your back on that nation in order to try to get them to come back to the table and to resolve the problems that they have. Second, you have financial punishments, embargoes, boycotts, sanctions against a country. So, for example, if a country is done something that you don't like, essentially all the other nations would get together and they would say, we will not trade with this country anymore. We will not buy their products. We will not sell them things. They can be a strong way of actually bringing that nation back to order, because obviously financial matters really help to run the world. And then finally, the last but not least, is that when a nation decides to break from the League of Nations, the other nations can choose to use a military option to bring them back into line. Perhaps this goes without saying, but think of the collective security as a scale in which shame is a very mild way of punishing a country, financial punishment is harsher, and a military strike would be the most serious. Those are the three ways in which the League of Nations has to bring other nations back to the table and in order to restore peace. So this is our first focus point in our chapter, to what extent was the League of Nations a success? As a reminder, what we are talking about here is, was the way that the League of Nations set up likely to fail just based on the way that they had things organized? The different organizations which make up the League, the different membership and how the membership ran, and this idea of collective security. Can this idea help to bring peace in Europe? Thanks for joining me today, and we'll have more discussions over the next couple weeks.